I've got about 5 or 10 minutes left with you before we open it up to the members. So let me just push again hard, because I like the discussion and I like debate on global governance. Right now, in 1945, when the Bretton Woods institutions started coming into formation, most of Africa was colonized. So didn't really have a say in the design and the setup of those institutions. And of course, those who won the war took the power. Now today, we're in a very turbulent time. Pandemic recovery and preparedness. We have the Ukraine-Russia war in Europe. We have geostrategic competition between the United States and China. Things are moving. And you had said in one of a speech that you gave, asking for more resources for South Africa's diplomacy in this time, you said transformation of the global system of governance must move from based on power to one based on rules. And we all talk about a rule-based international system, and we need to adhere to a rule-based international system. But truthfully, in state relations, power and rules guide these decisions. So how does South Africa leverage its participation in many forums, the G20, the G7, the BRICS, the African Union, SADC, to try to have influence on the establishment of what the new rules of the game will be and how the power dynamics will come out in favor of the African continent, not just South Africa, having more say, more influence on those very things that you just talked about?
Well, I think it can't just be South Africa. It has to be South Africa along with SADC, for example, or South Africa with the entire African Union, all of us in the G20. What we've been able to do in the G20 and as an invited participant in the G7 is to place Africa on the agenda of those formations. So it's important that South Africa is there, but it must always realize it's there on behalf of Africa and not on behalf of South Africa only. So that's very, very important. Second, I think this notion of international rules is very comfortable for some people to use when it suits them, but they don't believe in international rules when it doesn't suit them, because they don't apply international rules or law equally in all circumstances. So you can't say because Ukraine has been invaded that suddenly sovereignty is important, but it was never important for Palestine. It's very peculiar. If you believe in international law truly, then wherever sovereignty is infringed, it must apply. And this is the point we've been making, that we use the framework of international law unequally, depending on who is affected. And we are arguing that that must change. And one of the interesting changes that has occurred is the sudden movement, because Russia has invaded Ukraine, that we say, okay, let's not allow the Security Council to just have the veto and let it pass. We take it to the General Assembly. When some of us had been calling for the General Assembly to have a greater say, we never enjoyed support. But suddenly today, see, that's where international law begins to mean nothing. Because for some, we see it as a cheating, and for others, we see it as a benefit. So our argument is, let's revise the international multilateral system to ensure that we observe that post-1948 has arrived.
What is the revision that you're looking for?
Well, it should be more representative, more democratic. If we retain the Security Council, regions that are not represented there must have a space. And I think the move for the General Assembly to have a greater say is an important one. And it should be for everybody, not one country. So already the signs are there. Let's really ensure that we make these changes, which several countries have been calling for many, many years. We're now 54 independent African countries that are members of the African Union. we have 3 rotating non-permanent members that are elected every few years to the Security Council. I mean, what is that? So I really think we've got to rethink the multilateral system, ensure it's more fair, more open, transparent, and democratic.
Yes, yeah, I hear you, but you know, the sort of rules-based and normative part of it does help keep things within some guardrails to a degree.
No, absolutely. I mean, one wouldn't deny that there should be rules.
Right, no.
But it can't be that when it's this referee, that rule is okay, and then if it's a different referee, that rule, that's
Except
what
for
we
when
don't
it's
like.
countries with power.
Yeah, well,
I mean,
power,
that's the geostrategic.
Your power must lie in the degree to which everybody feels represented.
True.
If your power lies in you having authority over everybody and bullying, you're not really powerful, you're a bully.
Yeah, but Minister, you're not, because what you're doing is building an alliance around interests, right? And there's very few countries that strike out alone. They strike out with many others with them who may disagree with another set of alliance partners. That is sort of also one of the rules of the international system that has always been there.
Well, Ambassador, I think
yes.
the courage we must have, and hopefully the Council would lead on it, is we must change the philosophy. The philosophical orientation has to change toward the greater good.
Yes, but...
You know, because otherwise I'm powerful because people are starving in Lesotho.
Understood.
Which is crazy.
Understood, but when we look at South Africa's engagement on the continent of Africa, it uses and leverages its power, not always according to the norms of the continent. For example, taking over the chairpersonship of the African Union, which always was held by a small country until South Africa wanted it under Zuma, which created a lot of consternation because it was a norm there that actually the small countries do. But South Africa used its power and its interests, presumably because it thought it had something to contribute, but it broke a norm. So this is what powerful states do.
But, you know...
Not always, and we don't want that.
We broke that norm, which I think was good. We got a very good chair.
Yes, indeed.
At the time, who did a lot of the reforms that were necessary. So you had a country that could drive reforms.
Yes.
Didn't take the AU backwards, which would have been a real problem.
Yes, I would agree.
And I think a very new organization, having had one chairperson, really, we can't, you know, because the AU was new. They'd only been the first, the former premier of Gabon. She was the second. So I'm not sure that we broke a particular mold. There may have been a particular mold under the old Organization of African Unity. But now you had a very different organization. And South Africa didn't impose itself. It was elected by everybody in a proper assembly.
Okay, Minister.
But it's before my time. But there is an election. I've been in elections in the AU since becoming minister in this department. And you have to achieve a 2/3 majority.
Yeah, Minister, I'm gonna do something that I learned in South Africa when I was ambassador there, which is agree to disagree. This is what I learned in South Africa, and we'll come back to the topic. And the topic being where the disagreement is that the rules of the international system are there as guardrails, but power is also a huge factor that even sub-regional states, the powerful one that's in that sub-region will use their power in the interest of their interests. And
well, I don't know. It depends, doesn't it? And I would want to do case studies.
Yes, we can do that.
You know, examine whether indeed the exercise, as you call it, of power is totally negative in all cases.
No, not negative.
There may be instances where it might be, but let me give you an illustration. We've, over many years, have had a very, very difficult political environment in Lesotho.
Yes.
So 5 years ago, SADC appointed President Ramaphosa as the facilitator in what essentially was an impossible job because Basotho just liked to somehow be in conflict with each other. And the difficulty for us is whenever they have a political eruption, their people come into South Africa as refugees. So President Ramaphosa devoted a lot of time to drawing the different political parties together, the various stakeholders, traditional leaders, women, all groups, to converse about what form of political system they wish to see in place in order to end constant coups by the military, to stop the politicians fighting and so on. And so it's been 5 years of very difficult work. Now, if South Africa hadn't had the resources to pay for those stakeholder consultations, to have experts drafting constitutional documents and putting them before the Basotho to decide on, in the end it's their decision, but you need to give that support. So that kind of use of power, I think, is good.
Yes.
But when you use your power to come in and support an opposition group that isn't popular in a country, and you essentially want to eliminate a popular one because it doesn't agree with you ideologically, for me, that's an abuse of power. So I don't know, which aspect we're speaking of.
We're just talking about the use of power, which can be positive
can be
and
good,
also be negative,
absolutely.
but it's also a key element. But we're gonna come, before we end, we're gonna come back to leadership. I'm gonna come back to leadership, but I can't abuse the members. I know that they're anxious to get in, so at this point, I'd like to ask any of the members if they would like to ask a question. I want to remind you, though, that this conversation is on the record. And indeed, it will be taped and the video will be available. So when you ask your question, keep that in mind.